Okay, welcome everybody to another episode of Building Site. I'm Malcolm Sparks, CTO of Juxt, and we're with Jeremy Taylor again today, who's joining us, and we're going to be talking about authorization, which I think is a topic that we've talked about before, Jeremy.
We have, yeah. I think we spent a bit of time last year on XHTML, and you've been reading about something else.
Yeah, we have trodden this road before, but we haven't really been doing it while we've been streaming. So this would be a good chance to introduce authorization with XTDB. XTDB was formerly known as Crux, and it has been renamed. I think we finished the rename today, haven't we, Jeremy?
Yeah, we did just push out the 1.19 release. I haven't broadcast it on all the channels yet.
Right.
But that will happen a little bit later. But yeah.
Okay. Well, we're still languishing on an older release at the moment in this version of Site, but not to worry about this. So the purpose of this episode is really for me to kind of explain to Jeremy what I've been doing around trying to implement an authorization scheme. Now I've been looking at this Google Zanzibar technology. There's a paper that you can download from Google. Just Google it, and it's about their very, very high available authorization platform servicing 10 million requests a second and built on Spanner and all that amazing stuff. So I wanted to this seems to be the state of the art of authorization. So I just wanted to today introduce some of the concepts behind it and then do a little implementation of Zanzibar. So what Zanzibar, the paper kind of breaks everything into different sections. There's the most kind of important thing here is this idea of relation tuples, and this is their kind of guess this is their language. So they have this notion of triples, as we do, where instead of documents we call our documents XT entities, and in Google they're called objects. So these are the things that we're trying to protect access to, and then these documents have relations, and those relations can have. So when we're reading it here, we're sort of saying that the user might be the owner of an object, or they might belong to a set of users, or through a role or something that's been granted ownership, or the ability to comment on, or they have sort of arbitrary relations. And interestingly, the thing that I've noticed is that these objects belong in a namespace, and they have this configuration language inside the namespace, which they call a namespace configuration. I kind of think they're conflating the word namespace and, I suppose, authorization rules. So let's just dive in a little bit to the namespaces. So I have quite a neat way of a succinct notation, which is kind of similar to ours. And then down here, this is a kind of configuration where they're saying that, okay, you've got access if you're the owner of the document, for example, okay. So the thing about namespace configurations is that they are full of rules, and the rules are fairly graph-like queries. And the interesting thing is that they can support different sets of rules. So we were talking about XHTML and policy-based authorization and role-based authorization. They can do all these different schemes. So as an application, you might choose you wanted role-based authentication or authorization, and the Zanzibar manages 1,500 of these kind of schemes. They probably have one for YouTube and one for Google Docs and so on. But that's an awful lot of flexibility. So I wanted to just show kind of how Zanzibar works by doing a quick and dirty kind of implementation in XT. So I'm going to just copy and paste this. I'm going to imagine that we're working in the health sector. So I've copied from the XT test suite here, Jeremy, kind of some tricks where we can write a test with this with Croc, so we can bind in a new version of a new node, an in-memory node of XT, and then we've got this ability to. I don't think we'll need this, but this ability to host that onto a site handler. Okay, so we'll do a very, very quick and dirty test. We'll put in John into the database, and we'll just make sure that we'll pretend John, just a fictional example here, we'll pretend that he's a patient in our hospital. And then what I'm going to do is do a little, can I find John? So we'll say, let's imagine that the database is this node, and we're going to find him with an XT query. So here we're going to write, say, find me any patient, any entity where, let's say, he has a role of patient. Okay, so if we run that, we have one patient in our system, all alone, John. I feel sorry for John, so I'm going to join him in the hospital. We'll call that Mal. And now we have, invalid, what's happened there? Invalid, probably because I need to, I put it in the wrong place, didn't I? I need to copy that whole thing. Still not. No, because I've got to make that Mal. Right, there we are. Okay, so then I decided that I wanted to imagine that John has a heart rate monitor connected by his bedside, and I went off I wanted to know how is this modeled in the real world, and so I went off to did a search for examples, like JSON example. I think I searched for heart rate. That's heart rate example, and then so let's just jump in here. I'm not quite sure why that. Looks like in healthcare they don't worry much about security certificates, but well. So here we have some JSON that represents an observation. Have you seen this before, Jeremy? The HL7.
Oh, I mean, I've seen it, not at this level of detail. I'm vaguely aware it exists, I guess.
Yeah. It's quite intriguing. I mean, HL7 is something that's been around for years and years, but I was quite intrigued to see this sort of effective date time of, any observation surely does have an effective time in the real world. And if you were doing a diagnostics or trying to diagnose, why a patient fell dead, you probably want the observations to be in the timeline of when they happened, not when the database knew about them. So it's just a good example of bitemporality. So I think what we can do is we can take this. It's got some really nice ideas in here, and one of them is that they define all these units of measure, and there's codes for the different vital signs. So this code for heart rate is 88674. You could probably just Google that. 88674, and we get to here we are, heart rate, which is a coded measurement. Okay, all good. So but this was really new to me. It's the first time I've ever seen this JSON format. But interestingly, it's got this idea of a category, and we'll come to this later. And data categories in the GDPR, they talk very much about these data categories. Categories. So the medical folks have grouped heart rate and possibly other things like blood pressure into a category called vital signs. So when we're consenting, when John might consent to let me see his vital signs, he might want to group them all together, and not just, oh, you can see my heart rate and you can see my blood pressure. These things probably are going to be processed together. Okay, so we've got to do a little bit of... so what we'll do is we'll pretend that I've coded this up in Eden. So we've got a heart rate here for John, where I've taken I've called this a resource type of observation, and I've got some vital signs. The category is vital signs, and I've copied the structure here, but I've given it a keyword namespace of HL7. Actually, that's meant to be there. There we are. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to sort of show is, can John see his own, how do we kind of create a system where John is the owner of his heart rate? And then I got thinking, and I'm not sure I've come across the right, we could just say owner John here for this measurement. But then I thought, well, it's really that John owns this entity rather than this particular document. If we take new heart rates, then we would have to remember to give him the ownership of each one. So we could do it this way. Just for now, I've decided that it would be good to put in as a separate document. It's a bit of a metadata document. It's saying that let's give John access to his own heart rate, such that we could revoke that access later on. So I kind of need to create a mapping between John and his own heart rate. So I did it this way. Let's is that right? Have I done it? So this is saying John can see his heart rate measurement. Okay. So then I wanted to write a query to say that John, can John see his own heart rate? And so I decided to put in a where clause, rather than this where clause, be able to say, well, let's check that there is some access control list. Now, I need to introduce this access control list, Jeremy, because it's a funny word, it's a funny term, but Zanzibar has this concept of access control lists are not necessarily lists. A simple one could just be a let me find where it introduces the first ACL. Yeah, we'll get on.
It's almost like access control logic or something. It's not list as a...
Yeah, right. It's a bit of a misnomer. Here we are. Yeah, ACL is a collections of object user. So it says where's its first example? Let me find this is the introduction. Yeah. This is all about the operational side. I'm trying to find the first mention of an access control list. Yeah, here we are. Yeah, I beg your pardon. A simple ASL takes the form of user U has relation R to object O. So this is where we're saying John has a relation owner to his heart rate, whereas the object, this is the document. So that doesn't appear to me to be a list. That is just really a statement. It's a triple. But I guess it can be a group of triples, and you can group them. But that's why I wanted to, they use the word ACL. I think it's more like a grant, or it's more like a kind of an association or of metadata, or kind of some relation that you add to the system, some mapping. Anyway, so I'm gonna call them ACLs anyway. So this thing here is an ACL, right? This is a simple ACL. So let's check that. We'll go back to the paper, and the paper talks in terms of checks. That's where is it? Yeah, I think it's section 3. Yeah, check evaluation. So you can check that check is saying, am I authorized? There's read, which is let me read the ACLs, and you can write them and modify them, and then you can actually listen for changes to them. But that's Zanzibar's kind of API that they explain in the paper. So if we go back to implement, this is why I've called it check. So we're checking that for an ACL, and it needs to take some inputs. So the inputs I'm going to give it are the user that is trying, or we'll call that the subject. That's the person trying to do the operation, and then we have a thing called the doc, the document. Okay, and I also wanted to put in this notion of purpose, because we'll come to it later, but in GDPR there's always a question of what are you trying to do? What's your legal basis for processing? Are you trying to spam this person with an email, or are you trying to save their life, or whatever? You're trying to save their life, you don't need their consent, because it falls under what's called vital interest, and it's to do with life and death of the patient. So I put purpose in there so that we can bring those checks in later. Is that all right, Jeremy? Is it? We're going a bit.
Yeah, that all sounds okay. So just to clarify, this is a data logger rule. We've not defined the rule yet. This is just the sort of invocation of it.
Yeah.
The document maps to E. So do you want to rename E to document? Is that the?
Yeah. We're going to pull out. Well, actually, in this case, I want to find the ACL that matched, because I feel that if we knew how the authorization, we can then add things to that ACL, like the fields that we want to allow, or the scope, the read or write, or that provide some information about that authorization. We already have the object. That's the object under scrutiny. We've already identified which object and who the subject is. It's now we've got to kind of matchmake and say, is this subject allowed to look at this object? So returning the object isn't going to help. And I'm doing this from the point of view of GraphQL, where we already have the object. It's in our tree somewhere, and now we're asking, can we access these fields? So the reason why our site rules don't really help us here is because the site rules tend to operate at the beginning of the request, and they say, well, can this person access GraphQL? But we've already established that. But now we're down deep in the tree, and we're sort of saying, well, the doctor might be able to see John's name, but can he see extra stuff, like heart rate? Okay, so shall I write the rule? So a simple rule would be, let's write that document purpose. I think that's really entity here, or E in this case. And we'll say that the ACL, I'm going to say it has an owner of the subject, and that the kind of refers to the E. Okay, so this is what I did here. I said it's like the owner here of this heart rate is John, and the entity is the heart rate document. So now when we do that, we're saying, well, okay, we've got to. It's interesting that it's
because you don't not using part capitals.
No, I think the rules have to be in a. Yeah, there we are. So that works, but we've got to send in values for these things. So we do where check. Yeah, so now we're going to say in, and we're going to provide the subject and the entity and the purpose. And now that will fail because we haven't provided. So in the query, we now can provide the subject. So I'll put in the subject of John, and we'll put in the entity as the heart rate, and we'll just say email. So here we can see that John can see his own report, but let's do a pull on this actually. Pull, so we can see all the details of this. There we are. So John can see his own report. Can I see his report? No, I can't. Can you? No, you can't either. So we've got a very, very primitive authorization working there, which is the rule that you can, if you're the owner of a document, then you can see it. And I felt it would be good to, you could sort of decide that you wanted to put some scopes in here. You could say scope, read, write, manage, or that kind of thing, a later date. Okay, so that was, I think we've got 10 minutes left. So shall we do something a little bit more complex?
Yeah, please. It's a good start there.
So yeah, so let's imagine that like John's in bed. I mean, he can access his own heart rate because it's his heart, but he wants to provide consent to his doctor to do that. I'm going to pretend that reading your heart rate isn't a vital interest and it requires consent, although I'm sure that that's not actually true. So let's create Bob, Dr. Bob. That's John's doctor. And let's see if Bob can see John's heart rate. No, he can't. And he's not going to be the owner either. So I thought it would be quite nice to create this idea of a consent. So I created this. Now here we are inventing for this application a bunch of authorization features. We're saying there are things called access control lists. We're using Zanzibar terminology. We're saying that there's going to be this idea of consent and like a GDPR policy-based kind of authorization. But we don't have to. We might have some apps where we decide, well, all doctors, Bob is in the role of doctors, and all doctors can read everybody's heart rate, and that's fine, and we don't need consent. But I just wanted to show how Zanzibar and this model supports whatever authorization scheme is relevant to your business domain, rather than kind of many authorization products that say, no, well, these are the feature set, does RBAC, and you've got to model your domain in terms of RBAC. Well, so let's put in I've got an idea. We'll put in a little resource called Bob is John's doctor. Okay, and then we'll give it a type. This is really a consent document, and I wanted to model it this way, Jeremy, because I feel that consents are things that you can revoke. You can withdraw your consent at any time. John might suddenly think, oh, I don't trust this doctor, I want to withdraw my consent. And it would be nice when we've got the bitemporal features working that we can ask questions of the database and saying, well, when did Bob have consent? What was the time interval from which John granted consent and withdrew consent? And I think that would really show off, well, not show off, but, like show the value proposition of bitemporality. So I'm going to... Sorry, Jeremy.
No, I mean, I guess there's also like, doctors covering for each other. They'd be like, oh, I'm going on holiday next week, I'll give you consent for all my patients. Or...
Oh yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, does John provide Bob the consent to provide his consent to other doctors, or do you inherit? Yeah, that might be something you fill out on the form. If Bob is not available here to do your operation, do you mind if Sandy does it? Or do you mind if Bob nominates another competent surgeon or something?
For this period in the future.
Yeah, and it would almost, you can imagine consent could be more fine-grained than it is today, if you had the technology to support it. So here I've said that John has granted this consent, because we're going to need that information. The other thing is that we're going to need this idea of John's heart rate. That's the entity that is under authorization. That's the context. Then we have Bob is the receiver of the grant. He's the one who receives the consent. And then we could kind of say, well, I give Dr. Bob the scope to read my heart rate. I don't want him to write to my heart rate. That would be kind of a bit weird, and give me electric shock treatment or whatever. I might not want my heart rate to be modified. And then I've put, I think I mentioned this before, this purpose, which will say this is a purpose is medical intervention. And then finally I said, a consent to not just this entity, why not a consent to all of my entities that have a particular category. Actually, this might break down because I haven't really thought about it, but here we are. We have the category here, which is the vital signs category that actually comes from this vital signs actually is that code. That is the code for vital signs. So that comes from HL7 fire. Okay. 10 more minutes. So okay, so let's go back to John. John can see his heart rate, but can Bob see John's heart? Can see John's heart rate? No, not yet. So we have to define another rule that will allow Bob to see John's heart rate, and this is where it gets quite hard. And I don't know how we're going to make this easy, but let's first of all then check, can we find a consent somewhere in the system? That might be, yeah. You can run that. You get this XT error here, Jeremy, saying or join variable never used, which is kind of, I don't know if that's...
It's because the rules are converted into or joins under the hood, so the error message is actually essentially saying your rules need to use the same variables.
Right. And if you just decide purpose isn't important from this point of view, I could make purpose. I could say there has to be some purpose.
Well, use any. Any is the most generic way to do it. You don't have to bind it as well. Just have any purpose.
Like that.
Suppose you put any. Yeah.
Okay.
And that will go to the warning, but I think you might have to make them match basically.
Might have to do it up there as well.
Well, I think in this instance you might be able to get away with just adding on the bottom for subject and E, but yeah, essentially you always need to make them balance so that all the legs of the or join have the same variables, which is.
But why does it work? It works. It works here, but that doesn't complain about purpose, but it does.
Yeah. I'm not sure if it's complaining about purpose specifically. I think if you added an any for subject and E, it
Okay.
would work. So we change it to subject and one for E as well. So remove the purpose line, and then I think it will work.
This one?
I don't. Yeah, if you remove that, I think.
No, it's still complaining.
Right. Or maybe it's just if you're doing two different things. Maybe it's a different code path. In which case, yeah, you just need to make them balanced. So, on the top line, yeah, you'll need to add an any for purpose, and then it should work.
Oh, I see. If I do this on the top rule like that, if I do the same, I know. Oh, I see what you mean. Ah, yes, that worked.
Yeah.
So John can. So Bob can now see John's for any purpose. Well, that's okay. Well, let's make that a little bit tighter then. We can do that by we're okay. Well, what we could do is see if we could have another heart rate, one for me. I'll put in one for me, and then we can just make sure, because I haven't given the consent to Bob. So I'm going to put this one, I can say Malcolm's heart rate. And then we can say that's Mal, vital signs is the same, everything is all the same, but I'm going to say my heart rate, I'm cycling a bike and I'm at 120. Okay, so what we'd like to make sure is that we write this rule such that Bob cannot see my heart rate. So that's a kind of failing test, because we found an ACL, which is Bob is John's doctor. Well, that's got nothing to do with Malcolm, so that obviously needs to be strengthened. So let's say that, sorry, Jeremy?
The granted by would be the first one to go for it.
The granted by, yeah, exactly. So granted by, let's say the granted by needs to be the owner.
Subject.
Sorry,
not the subject.
Yeah, we could say subject. Yeah. Okay, that's worked for me. Let's see if John can. No, can't see John's.
So. Yeah, I'm not sure why that would be.
Oh, because we've got any subject there, I guess.
Yeah, that should be ignored because it's sort of redundant. But you can try deleting it.
So why is that working? Well, because the subject here is Bob. So we're not talking about the
subject Bob, right?
Owner.
Oh, okay. You're right. Sorry, yeah.
It's not granted. Yeah, there's got to be this idea of actually we could say the grantee is the
grantor
subject.
Oh yeah, grantee would be the subject.
The
yeah,
subject. So okay, so now Bob can see John's heart rate, but can he see my heart rate? Oh, he can see my heart rate because we've said that we've only limited it to Bob. We're just saying kind of if you're Bob, you can, and there's a consent document. But now we've got to strengthen it a little bit more, and we've got to say, well, that has to be the owner of the entity, but we don't have the entity here because we've only found the ACL. So what I was able to do, Jeremy, and this was a bit took me a bit of playing around, but I said, well, is there does the owner have access to, so you're almost saying, well, I have access to something, I'm going to consent for somebody to have the same access as me. So I ended up doing that. Do you think that's reasonable, or is that?
I think that makes sense. Yeah.
I guess I could. So now I can say Bob cannot see my heart rate. Can he see John's heart rate? I'll check for John on there. Yes, John can see. So now let's withdraw that consent just to see that it's working. Let's just pretend that consent doesn't exist. And then Bob can't see John's heart rate. John consents, and Bob is back. But let's imagine that we use this purpose. Let's email spam. Say that Dr. Bob is actually he's got a business and he wants to email John about buying some medical equipment. And John's getting fed up. He doesn't want to buy anything from the hospital. He just wants to get fixed. So why don't we make the purpose? So we'll say, rather than any purpose, we'll say that the purpose has got to match. So let's say that the ACL purpose, not here, but here, has got to match the purpose. So now we don't find it. Now when Dr. Bob wants to email John, doesn't get access. But if he wants to do a medical intervention, he does get access. So we can get rid of this any purpose now. No, we can't. We've got to put it up at the...
Yeah, well, repeat that clause on the first one.
At the top, but the second one isn't needed.
Well, we could repeat it for the first one, right? So we could say for the... You need a purpose.
Oh, yeah, you need to... Yeah. Yeah, but it is really saying John can access his own information for any purpose. We are not worried about what he wants to do because he's got the right to do everything.
True. Yeah.
So I like that. I like the fact we've got it working with any, because it does sort of say, how do you indicate that you don't care about an input? Okay, I think we'll almost leave it at there. Only I wanted to bring in this idea of categories. So now let's imagine that we want this consent isn't about like vital signs. Let's pretend that it is about another category like body weight. Okay, so what we'd like is here for Bob to have got John's consent to read his body weight, but not his vital signs. So when I run that query, we really would like this consent to be a bit more fine-grained. So now we have to bring in this idea of category. Well, the ACL has and this is what I ended up writing. I'd say that the ACL has a HL7 fur category, and I called that the ACL category. And I said, well, the consent, that's the consent. The entity also has a category, and I called that the E category. And then I said, well, the getting from the ACL category, I've got to get these because they're nested down, and that's what FHIR does. I mean, there's lots of nesting in these medical documents, and that's just because it's a complicated domain, and that's okay, and we should support it. So there's code, and we'll call that we'll bind that to a thing called code, and we'll say here that the entity category, the thing that we're authorizing, also has a code, must have the same code. So now poor old Bob doesn't get access to the vital signs, because if we put the consent back, oh, that didn't work. No, why didn't that work?
It's the getting, right?
E category. The ACL has a category, and do the vital signs have a category?
Do you category in the other rule as well?
Yeah, I have a code, vital signs, and down here, this has a code of vital signs. So it's something that I've done. Now the question is how to sort of debug this. if we...
Well, isn't that category, so shouldn't all those 3 lines be on the bottom rule, not the top rule?
Yes, you're right. Yeah, that would help, wouldn't it? Actually, because this rule is about, this is about consent,
Yeah.
access by consent. There we go. So we can see vital signs, but if we withdraw that consent, or we made that consent body signs, then it disappears. So here we are only referencing something about the entity's category. We're not referencing anything about the entity itself, which is so this is I think this is quite a powerful I think this is a powerful way of doing authorization, because it's really flexible, and you get to decide the rules. It's really, and then so to finish off, Jeremy, I feel that this whole query belongs in what Zanzibar would call a namespace configuration, where the namespace is resolved or determined by the object. What does that mean? Well, it would mean that if this John's heart rate here, there would be something in here to say what domain it was in. So it would just like, okay, let's call it the, let's say that's in an authorization domain or authorization rules, and we could say like medical, and then we could have another an entity here which say, oh right, medical rules, and we could say rule, or query is like this thing. Would this work? We'll just bung that thing into the medical rules. Yeah, that would go in there, and then we can just pull out X entity DB medical, and pull out, was it rules or query? So that still works. So this is this idea that that John's heart rate. Has that worked? Well, I said medical, so I suppose I'd have to, I have to kind of do a d-entity of that from the database, and then say, well, what domain do you, what did I call it? Authorization rules. Oh dear, what have I done this for? Right, okay. So let's say rules are, well, let's just put it there. And then rules. Namespace master. I probably mucked it up here.
Never seen that error before. Namespace map.
Let's specify a map. Have I take that away? No, it's some.
Oh, was it because you quoted it? No.
No, I don't think so. I think I've just I've put a rogue character in somewhere.
I'll save something for the next episode anyway.
Yeah, I will go back. It will probably be. Here we are. I think that will. Good old undo. There we are. So I think that we'll wrap it up for that one. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, it's really nice. I like the sort of naturally recursive nature of it. it'd be fascinating to see this, how this plays out with the rest of the Zanzibar sort of concept with the caching and the idea of different namespaces. I guess there's an optimization there so that you're not having to check all the rules against all the objects.
It will depend how quickly these queries run, but the point of Zanzibar is that you do these queries and then you cache them, and you only reevaluate them if there's this concept of a Zuki, and so when you update something that is potentially secret, you update the Zuki with the time. So most information like John's heart rate might be historical, and we've already, can we set the Zuki at the last time that we did that evaluation. So most of the times is only if we're updating that, and this is what they call the new enemy problem, where you've gone and you've given Bob access to something, and then you've changed the thing that he's got access to. Because it's okay, if you've revoked Bob's access, he still has access, he could have easily copied that reading from John, so you can't really stop him. He's already had access to that, so he might have copied it away on USB, so you can't really stop that anymore, so there's no point. It's only if you were to create a new secret or a new password or change something that you don't want him to then, because of the ordering. And this is what they talked about, that this is why it's a very interesting system, because they optimize it based on the problem domain. And so this is where they get the everything is time-stamped, and you can see there was this causally meaningful timestamps. So it's a very temporal system, and so the ability to say, well, I've already evaluated at this point in time in the database, and this is more recent than the time I'm being asked for, so therefore I can reuse the result. So, and what Zanzibar does also is that it quantizes these times. So instead of every millisecond, it says, well, let's just take a snapshot every 10 seconds. So there's more chance for a query to kind of ask for a timestamp that you already have. And they have this thing called Leopard that goes around all of the different Zanzibar nodes and asks them kind of what timestamp ranges they have. And there's this like global index of so that it's to do with spanner. So each individual server can choose a timestamp that it knows is globally replicated. But all of these tricks are to do with avoiding hitting the data log again and caching results. So I think it's nice that if we use the terminology and we use the core algorithms and we use this kind of Zuki and their concept of time, and you've got a time, the ability to do snapshot reads, you've got a bitemporal database, then I think you've got all the ingredients to create something that is scalable, at least for one node. And indeed, Zanzibar is a single, it does all of the names, all these 1,500 namespaces are all loaded by every ACL server. Every instance can authorize any request, so it's not a sharded system, or at least the rules aren't sharded. The objects are, of course, but anyway.
Yeah, well, the idea it serves millions of requests in production at scale. Yes, sounds like it's a winning system.
So what was it? Yeah, how much do they do? Something like 1 million a second or something.
Should keep us going for a while with the site.
I don't think we'll need. Yeah, here we are. Millions of authorizations per second. So I don't think we'll need much more than that. Very good. Anyway, well, thanks for that. We'll kind of play around with that. I think the next time we do this, we'll try and connect it up with GraphQL, and we can then switch from Dr. Bob, or we've got a question about the holiday system, and that we want people to consent that when they write that kind of where they're going when they're going to Bournemouth, is that a public knowledge or is that something they want to hide, and that should come with consent. So we can play around with that in GraphQL together. But yeah.
Okay. I'd be interested to check that out, and I could also help you with optimizing this data log a little bit as well. adding some hints to for the bind.
Yeah, that would be really super. I mean, I'm hoping that we can create perhaps another set of rules for our holiday system or our, the different apps that we write. But I think the general idea is pretty solid.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Malcolm.
All right, yeah, and thanks for everybody for watching. We'll see you in the next episode. But bye for now.